The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the suffocating silence of the abandoned fire station like a blade through flesh. Marcus' chin jerked awake from his restless sleep, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol beside his makeshift bed. For 6 months, the emergency frequency had been nothing but static and the occasional death scream echoing across the wasteland that used to be Portland. But this was different. This was a child's voice, small and terrified, whispering words that made his blood run cold. "Is anyone there? Please, someone help us. My mommy won't wake up and the bad people are trying to get in. We're in the big blue house on Maple Street. The number is 847. Please, I'm scared." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as he scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over the scattered supplies that littered the floor. He'd heard children's voices before during the first weeks of the outbreak, screams that haunted his dreams, pleas that went unanswered because there was no one left to answer them. But this was different. This child was alive, speaking in real time, and somehow had access to working radio equipment. "Sarah, wake up." Marcus shook his partner roughly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah Martinez had been a paramedic before the world ended, and her medical training had kept their small group of survivors alive through infections, injuries, and the constant threat of starvation. She stirred, her dark eyes immediately alert despite having been deep in sleep moments before. "What is it?" she asked, already reaching for her medical bag, a habit that had saved lives more times than either of them could count. "Radio transmission. There's a kid alive out there." Marcus replayed the message, watching as Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to determination. They'd lost so many people, had failed to save so many others. Children were the worst. The images of small bodies torn apart by the infected were burned into both their minds like brands. "Maple Street," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That's less than 2 miles from here. We could make it before dawn if we move fast." Marcus nodded, already pulling on his tactical vest and checking his weapons. The infected were slower in the cold morning hours, their rotting muscles stiff and unresponsive. It would be their best chance. But something about the transmission bothered him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The child's voice had been too clear, too composed for someone supposedly trapped with the living dead clawing at their door. As they prepared to leave, Marcus caught Sarah's arm. "What if it's a trap? We've seen what desperate people do now. Using a child's voice to lure survivors into ambushes." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with it. But if there's even a chance that kid is real, we have to try. We can't live with ourselves if we don't." The weight of their previous failures hung between them like a toxic cloud. 3 weeks ago, they'd heard gunshots from the shopping center and arrived to find a family of 4 who'd barricaded themselves in a sporting goods store. By the time Marcus and Sarah had fought their way through the infected, the family had been dead for hours. The father still clutched a photo of his children, their faces smiling up from happier times. They gathered their gear in silence: ammunition, medical supplies, water, and the portable radio that had become their lifeline to hope. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flicker of flames from distant fires that had been burning unchecked for months. The air tasted of ash and decay, a constant reminder of how thoroughly their world had collapsed. As they slipped out through the fire station's back entrance, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far worse than a simple rescue mission. The infected weren't their only concern anymore. The living had become just as dangerous, driven to unspeakable acts by hunger, desperation, and the gradual erosion of their humanity. But the child's voice echoed in his mind, small and frightened, asking for help that might never come. And despite every instinct screaming at him to stay hidden, Marcus Chin stepped into the darkness, praying they weren't already too late. Part 2: The Journey Through Hell. The streets of Portland had become a maze of overturned cars, collapsed buildings, and the scattered remains of a civilization that had crumbled in a matter of weeks. Marcus and Sarah moved like ghosts through the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of ash that coated everything. The infected had learned to hunt in packs, and the slightest sound could draw dozens of them from their hiding places in the rubble. Sarah pressed close behind Marcus, her breath visible in the cold morning air. They developed a system of hand signals during their months of survival, a silent language born from necessity and refined by the constant threat of death. 2 taps on the shoulder meant infected nearby. 3 taps meant human survivors. A firm grip meant run. They'd made it 6 blocks when Marcus spotted the first body. A woman in a torn nightgown lay sprawled across the sidewalk, her throat ripped open, dried blood painting the concrete in dark pools. But it wasn't the gore that made Marcus's stomach clench, It was the small pink slipper lying just beyond her outstretched hand. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside the corpse. "She's been dead for hours, but look at this." She pointed to fresh scratches on the woman's arms, defensive wounds that were still bleeding. "This happened recently. Very recently." Marcus scanned the surrounding buildings, his rifle ready. "The kid's mother? Maybe. The injuries are consistent with an infected attack, but something's off." Sarah's medical training kicked in as she examined the body more closely. "These bite marks, they're too organized, too precise. The infected feed in a frenzy, tearing at anything they can reach. This looks almost surgical." A sound made them both freeze, a soft scraping noise coming from the direction of Maple Street. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone dragging a heavy object across asphalt. Marcus motioned for Sarah to follow, and they crept forward, using abandoned cars as cover. The blue house at 847 Maple Street stood like a monument to suburban normalcy in a world gone mad. Its windows were boarded up with plywood, and a child's bicycle lay overturned in the front yard, its wheels still spinning lazily in the breeze. But it was the front door that made Marcus's blood run cold. It hung open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. "The transmission said they were trapped inside," Sarah whispered. "If the door's open..." Marcus raised his hand for silence. The scraping sound was getting closer, and now they could hear something else, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from multiple throats. The infected were gathering, drawn by some stimulus they couldn't identify. They circled around to the back of the house, where a small window had been left unboarded. Marcus peered inside and immediately recoiled. The living room was a slaughterhouse. Furniture was overturned, walls were splattered with blood, and the carpet was soaked with bodily fluids. But there were no bodies, just drag marks leading toward the basement door. "We need to get in there," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the horror they'd witnessed. "If the kid's still alive." Marcus nodded, but his instincts were screaming warnings. The scene was too clean, too organized. In his experience, when the infected got into a house, they fed until nothing remained but bones and scraps of clothing. They didn't drag bodies away. They didn't leave evidence of such methodical carnage. They entered through the back door, moving with practiced stealth. The house smelled of death and something else, something chemical and sharp that made their eyes water. In the kitchen they found more evidence of the struggle. Overturned chairs, broken dishes, and a child's drawing taped to the refrigerator. It showed a happy family of 3, mother, father, and a little girl with pigtails, standing in front of the same blue house. The basement door stood ajar, and from below came the sound of mechanical humming, like medical equipment running on backup power. Marcus exchanged a look with Sarah. Nothing about this felt right, but they'd come too far to turn back now. As they descended the wooden steps, the smell grew stronger. The basement had been converted into some kind of laboratory, complete with surgical tables, monitoring equipment, and rows of glass containers filled with organic specimens. But it was the figure strapped to the central table that made Sarah gasp. A man in a blood-stained lab coat looked up at them with eyes that reflected no humanity, only hunger and malicious intelligence. His skin was pale and mottled, showing the early stages of infection, but his movements were coordinated, purposeful. This wasn't just another infected. This was something far worse. "Welcome," the creature said, its voice a rasping whisper. "I was wondering when someone would answer little Emma's call for help." Part 3, The Doctor's Revelation. Dr. Harrison Vex had been one of Portland's most respected pediatric surgeons before the outbreak, a man who'd dedicated his life to saving children, who'd worked 18-hour shifts during the first chaotic weeks trying to treat bite victims and develop some kind of cure. Now, strapped to his own operating table with restraints he'd obviously loosened himself, he looked like a grotesque parody of everything he'd once represented. "You're not fully infected," Sarah observed, her medical training overriding her revulsion. "The transformation is incomplete." Vex smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to sharp points. "Incomplete? My dear, I've achieved what no one else has managed. I've retained my cognitive functions while gaining the infected's appetites. I'm evolution in action." Marcus kept his rifle trained on the doctor while scanning the basement laboratory. The walls were lined with journals, medical charts, and photographs of children, dozens of them, all bearing the same expression of terror. "Where's the kid who made the radio call? Emma?" Vex's laugh was like broken glass. "She's been so helpful with my research. Children's neurological responses to the infection are fascinating. Their brains are still developing, which makes them perfect subjects for studying the virus's effects on cognitive function." Sarah stepped closer to the operating table, her jaw clenched with fury. "You're experimenting on children. You sick bastard." "I'm advancing medical science." Vex snarled, his composure cracking. "Do you know what I've discovered? The infected aren't just mindless cannibals. They're evolving, adapting. And those of us who can control the transformation, we're going to inherit what's left of this world." The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, slow, deliberate, and numerous. Marcus realized with growing horror that they'd walked into a trap. The radio transmission, the open door, the convenient evidence trail, it had all been designed to lure survivors into Vex's web. "You used that child's voice to bring people here," Marcus said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "How many others have you killed?" "Killed?" Vex seemed genuinely offended. "I've transformed them. I've given them purpose. The infected who serve me retain enough intelligence to follow complex instructions. They're the perfect hunting pack." Sarah noticed movement in the shadows behind the surgical equipment. "Marcus, we need to go. Now." But it was too late. The infected began emerging from hidden alcoves throughout the basement. A dozen of them, moving with coordinated precision that defied everything Marcus and Sarah knew about the virus. These weren't the shambling, instinct-driven creatures they'd learned to fight. These were weapons directed by a madman's twisted intelligence. "Emma was particularly useful," Vex continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. 7 years old, with such a sweet voice. She lasted 3 days before the transformation was complete. But her vocal cords remained intact, which made her perfect for my radio work. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The child they'd come to save had been dead for days, her voice somehow preserved and used as bait. The radio transmission had been a recording, played at intervals to draw in survivors. "You monster," Sarah whispered, but Vex was already laughing again. "Monster? I'm a visionary. The old world is dead and I'm building something new from its ashes. Every survivor who comes here adds to my collection, my understanding of how the virus affects different demographics. I'm close to a breakthrough that will change everything." The infected moved closer, their movements eerily synchronized. Marcus counted at least 15 of them, including several that still wore the torn remnants of children's clothing. His ammunition wouldn't last long in a prolonged firefight, especially in the confined space of the basement. "The stairs," Sarah said quietly, edging toward the exit. "We need to get to the stairs." But Vex had anticipated their escape route. 2 of his controlled infected blocked the stairway, their milky eyes fixed on the survivors with predatory focus. Unlike normal infected, these creatures didn't rush forward in a feeding frenzy. They waited, patient and calculating. "You see," Vex said, his voice filled with twisted pride. "Intelligence. Strategy. The infected under my control are superior to their wild cousins in every way. They can plan, coordinate, even use tools when necessary." Marcus noticed something that made his stomach turn. The infected were armed. Simple weapons, mostly improvised blades and clubs, but weapons nonetheless. The virus had somehow preserved enough cognitive function for them to understand and employ complex tactics. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, buying time while he searched for another way out. "What? I want to complete my research. I want to understand how the virus affects different genetic markers, different age groups, different medical conditions. You two are going to help me with that." Vex's smile widened. "The woman's medical background makes her particularly valuable. As for you, well, we'll see how military training affects the transformation process." Sarah caught Marcus's eye and nodded toward a stack of medical equipment near the far wall. If they could create enough of a distraction, they might be able to fight their way out. But the odds were impossibly stacked against them, and they both knew it. The rescue mission had become a nightmare, and they were running out of time. Part 4. The Experiment Chamber. The basement laboratory was a monument to medical perversion, its sterile surfaces stained with the evidence of Vex's grotesque experiments. Along the walls, glass containers held floating specimens, organs, tissue samples, and things that had once been human but were now transformed into something unrecognizable. The smell of formaldehyde mixed with decay created a nauseating cocktail that made Sarah's eyes water. "You want to see my greatest achievement?" Vex asked, his voice taking on the tone of a professor addressing medical students. "Let me show you what I've learned about the virus's effects on developing neural pathways." He gestured toward a section of the basement that had been hidden behind a movable partition. As the barrier slid away, Marcus and Sarah found themselves staring into a nightmare beyond comprehension. A dozen metal cages lined the walls, each containing a child in various stages of infection. Some were completely transformed, their small bodies twisted into inhuman shapes. Others still retained fragments of their humanity, their eyes pleading for a mercy that would never come. The younger subjects are more resilient, Vex explained with clinical detachment. Their neural plasticity allows them to adapt to the virus in ways that adult subjects cannot. I've been able to extend the transformation process, study each stage in detail. Sarah's medical training warred with her humanity as she processed what she was seeing. These children, they're still conscious during the transformation? Of course. That's the beauty of my research. I've developed a serum that slows the virus's progression while maintaining the subject's awareness. They can feel every change, experience every stage of their evolution. It's provided invaluable data about the virus's neurological effects. Marcus felt his trigger finger twitch. The man before him had abandoned every principle of medical ethics, every shred of human decency. But killing Vex wouldn't solve their immediate problem. They were still surrounded by his controlled infected, and the basement was quickly becoming a death trap. Emma's in the last cage, Vex said, pointing to a small figure huddled in the corner. She's been particularly responsive to my treatments. Her vocal cords remained intact throughout the transformation, which is why her voice recordings are so convincing. The thing in the cage had once been a 7-year-old girl, but now it was something else entirely. Its limbs had elongated, its fingers ending in sharp claws that scraped against the metal bars. But the most horrifying aspect was its eyes, still human, still aware, still trapped inside a body that no longer belonged to it. She tries to sing sometimes, Vex continued. Nursery rhymes mostly. The neural pathways associated with memory and speech are remarkably persistent, even after extensive viral modification. Sarah moved closer to the cage, her heart breaking at the sight of what Emma had become. The child thing looked up at her with eyes that held both recognition and desperate hope. It opened its mouth as if to speak, but only a harsh, guttural sound emerged. The transformation affects the larynx gradually, Vex explained. Human speech becomes increasingly difficult, but the attempt to communicate remains. It's fascinating from a neurological perspective. Marcus had heard enough. You're completely insane. Am I? Or am I the only one who sees the truth? The old world is dead and these children are the future. They're stronger, faster, more resilient than any human. I'm not destroying them, I'm improving them. The controlled infected began moving closer, their movements synchronized like a pack of wolves. Marcus realized that Vex's experiments had created something far more dangerous than random infected. These creatures could think, plan, and coordinate attacks with military precision. How many others know about this place? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the horror surrounding them. Others? There are no others. I'm the only one who's had the vision to see what the infection truly offers. Other survivors are too focused on fighting the virus, on finding a cure. They don't understand that the virus isn't a disease. It's the next step in human evolution. Marcus noticed something crucial. The infected were responding to Vex's emotional state. When he became agitated, they grew more aggressive. When he was calm, they remained still. The doctor's control over them was somehow tied to his own mental state. The serum you developed, Sarah said, her medical mind working even in the face of terror. It's not just slowing the transformation. It's creating a psychic link between you and the infected. Vex's eyes lit up with delight. Brilliant. Yes, that's exactly what I've discovered. The virus affects the brain's electromagnetic patterns, creating a form of shared consciousness. I can influence their behavior, direct their actions, even share their sensory experiences. That's impossible, Sarah protested. The virus damages neural tissue. It can't create new neural pathways. Can't it? You're thinking like a doctor from the old world, limited by outdated assumptions about brain function. The virus doesn't just damage, it reconstructs. It creates new neural networks, new forms of consciousness. I'm not just studying the infected, I'm becoming one of them. Marcus caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward the stairs. If they were going to escape, they needed to move before Vex's mental state deteriorated further. The controlled infected were growing restless, their synchronized movements becoming more aggressive. But as they began to edge toward the exit, Emma's cage rattled violently. The transformed child was trying to communicate, its clawed hands pointing frantically at something behind them. Marcus turned to see more infected emerging from hidden passages throughout the basement, dozens of them all moving with the same eerie coordination. Did you really think I'd let you leave? Vex asked, his voice now completely devoid of humanity. You're going to become part of my research whether you cooperate or not. I've learned so much from unwilling subjects. The trap was closing and their chances of escape were diminishing by the second. But Emma's desperate attempts to warn them suggested that not all of Vex's subjects had completely lost their humanity, a fact that might be the key to their survival. Part 5. The Desperate Gambit. The basement had become a chamber of horrors, with Vex-controlled infected forming an ever-tightening circle around Marcus and Sarah. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and the metallic taste of fear. Marcus counted at least 20 infected, their movements perfectly synchronized, their eyes reflecting the mad intelligence of their creator. "You know what I find most fascinating?" Vex said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "The infected retain emotional memory. They remember love, fear, pain, but they're filtered through the virus's influence. It creates such interesting behavioral patterns." Sarah noticed that some of the infected were wearing medical scrubs, their name tags still visible beneath the bloodstains. They'd been Vex's colleagues, his staff, people who'd trusted him during the initial outbreak. Now they were his willing slaves, trapped in bodies that no longer belonged to them. "Your serum," Sarah said, her mind racing. "It's not just controlling them, it's making them suffer. They're conscious enough to know what they've become." Vex's smile widened. "Suffering is just another form of data. Every scream, every tear, every moment of despair teaches us something new about the virus's effects on human consciousness." Marcus spotted something that made his heart race, a fire axe mounted on the wall near the electrical panel. If he could reach it, he might be able to cut power to the basement and create enough confusion to escape. But the infected were positioned strategically, blocking every potential escape route. Emma's cage rattled again, more violently this time. The transformed child was making desperate gestures, pointing at specific infected and then at herself. It took Marcus a moment to understand what she was trying to communicate. Some of the infected were fighting Vex's control, struggling against the psychic link that bound them to his will. "They're not all completely under your control," Marcus said, testing his theory. "Some of them are still fighting." Vex's expression darkened. "A few subjects have shown remarkable resistance to the neural integration process. It's a minor setback, nothing more. The strong-willed ones require more intensive treatment." Sarah moved closer to Emma's cage, her heart breaking at the sight of the child's desperate attempts to communicate. "She's trying to help us," she whispered. "She's still in there, still fighting." Emma was particularly stubborn, Vex admitted. It took 3 separate treatments to achieve even partial compliance. But her resistance has provided valuable data about the virus's interaction with developing neural pathways. Marcus realized that Emma's partial resistance might be their only chance. If she could influence the other infected, create enough chaos to disrupt Vex's control, they might be able to fight their way out. "Emma," Sarah said softly, approaching the cage. "Can you understand me?" The transformed child nodded, its movements jerky and painful. It pointed at the other infected, then made a gesture that looked like an explosion, spreading its clawed hands outward in a burst pattern. "She wants to disrupt their connection," Marcus said, understanding dawning. "She thinks she can break Vex's control." "Impossible," Vex snarled. "The neural link is too strong. Even if one subject breaks free, the others will maintain the connection." But Emma was already moving, her cage rattling as she began to emit a high-pitched keening sound. The noise was unlike anything Marcus had ever heard, part human scream, part animal howl, and something else entirely. The other infected began to respond, their synchronized movements becoming erratic. "Stop her!" Vex shouted, but his controlled infected were struggling to maintain their formation. The psychic link was being disrupted by Emma's interference, creating feedback loops that sent waves of confusion through the connected minds. Marcus didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged toward the fire axe, shouldering aside an infected that was too disoriented to respond effectively. The blade came free with a satisfying weight, and he immediately brought it down on the nearest electrical panel, sending showers of sparks across the basement. The laboratory plunged into darkness, lit only by the emergency lighting and the glow from various medical equipment. In the chaos, Sarah managed to reach Emma's cage, working frantically to pick the lock with tools from her medical kit. "You're destroying everything," Vex screamed, his voice breaking with rage and desperation. Years of research, irreplaceable data. The infected were becoming increasingly agitated, their movements chaotic as Emma's interference continued to disrupt their mental connections. Some were attacking each other while others stood motionless, trapped between conflicting neural impulses. Sarah finally got the cage open and Emma crawled out, her transformed body moving with surprising grace despite its grotesque appearance. The child looked up at Sarah with eyes that held both gratitude and immense sadness. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice barely recognizable but unmistakably human. "I've been trying to fight him for so long." Marcus swung the axe at the nearest infected, cutting it down before it could coordinate with the others. "We need to move. This whole place is going to collapse." But Vex had one final card to play. He pulled out a remote control device, his thumb hovering over a large red button. "If I can't have my research, then no one can. This basement is rigged with enough explosives to take out half the block." "You're bluffing," Sarah said, but the look in Vex's eyes suggested otherwise. "Am I? I've spent months preparing for this possibility. If my work is threatened, I'll ensure that no one else can benefit from it. The virus's secrets will die with me." Emma let out another keening wail, and the remaining infected suddenly turned toward Vex, their eyes no longer reflecting his will but their own desperate hunger. The psychic link was completely broken, and the doctor's control over his subjects had evaporated. "No!" Vex screamed as his own creations began to advance on him. "You're supposed to obey me. I created you." Marcus grabbed Sarah and Emma, pulling them toward the stairs as the basement erupted into chaos. Behind them, they could hear Vex's screams mixing with the growls of the infected as they finally claimed their tormentor. The rescue mission had become a nightmare, but they weren't out of danger yet. The real horror was just beginning. Part 6, The House of Horrors. The upper floors of the house revealed the true scope of Vex's madness. As Marcus, Sarah, and Emma climbed the basement stairs, they discovered that the entire building had been converted into a twisted laboratory. Each room contained evidence of experiments that pushed the boundaries of human decency. Surgical tables stained with blood, walls covered with anatomical diagrams, and containers filled with specimens that had once been living people. Emma moved with surprising agility despite her transformed state, her elongated limbs allowing her to navigate the debris-strewn hallways with ease. But her eyes held a constant sadness, the weight of what she'd become and what she'd witnessed crushing her remaining humanity. "How many others?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma held up both hands, then repeated the gesture several times. "Too many to count." The house had been a processing center for Vex's experiments, a place where dozens of survivors had been lured to their doom by the promise of rescue. The sound of explosions echoed from below, confirming that Vex's threats weren't empty. The basement laboratory was being consumed by fire and chemical reactions, sending toxic smoke pouring through the ventilation system. They needed to get out before the entire structure collapsed. "There," Marcus pointed to a window at the end of the hallway. "We can reach the roof of the adjacent building." But as they moved toward the window, they discovered they weren't alone. Other survivors were trapped throughout the house, people who'd been captured and prepared for experimentation but hadn't yet been subjected to Vex's tortures. Their cries for help echoed through the smoke-filled corridors. "We can't leave them," Sarah said, her medical oath compelling her to help despite the danger. Marcus wanted to argue, to point out that they barely had enough time to save themselves, but he knew Sarah was right. They'd already failed to save Emma from her transformation. They couldn't abandon others to the same fate. They began a frantic search through the upper floors, finding survivors locked in bedrooms that had been converted into holding cells. A family of 4 huddled in one room, their eyes wide with terror. An elderly man sat in another, his hands shaking as he mumbled prayers. A teenage girl pressed against the far wall, her clothes torn and bloody from failed escape attempts. "The house is going to collapse," Marcus explained quickly. "We need to get everyone to the roof now." But moving a group of traumatized survivors through a burning building proved nearly impossible. The family couldn't stop crying, their terror making them almost catatonic. The elderly man's legs gave out after a few steps, forcing Marcus to carry him. The teenage girl kept looking back, convinced that more infected were following them. Emma tried to help, her transformed appearance initially terrifying the other survivors until they realized she was trying to guide them to safety. Her ability to see in the dark and navigate through smoke made her invaluable, but every moment they spent in the house increased their chances of being trapped. The smoke was getting thicker, and the chemical fires from the basement were spreading through the ventilation system. Marcus could hear the structure groaning under the stress of the explosions, support beams cracking as the foundation became unstable. "This way," Emma pointed toward a service ladder that led to the roof. Her voice was becoming increasingly distorted as the transformation continued to affect her vocal cords, but her intelligence remained intact. They climbed one by one, helping the weakest survivors while Emma scouted ahead. The roof was their only chance of escape, but it was also exposed to any infected that might be roaming the neighborhood. The sound of the explosions would draw them like moths to flame. As they reached the rooftop, Marcus surveyed their options. The adjacent building was close enough to jump, but it would require precise timing and considerable courage. The family with children would need help, and the elderly man would have to be carried. The fire department building, Sarah pointed to a structure 3 blocks away. If we can reach it, we might be able to use their radio equipment to call for help. But help from whom? The government had collapsed months ago, and most rescue organizations had been overrun by the infected. They were truly on their own, a small group of survivors in a dead world. Emma was changing before their eyes, her transformation accelerating under the stress of their escape. Her human features were becoming more distorted, her limbs continuing to elongate. But her eyes remained focused, her intelligence intact despite the physical changes. She's fighting it, Sarah observed. The virus is trying to complete the transformation, but she's maintaining her human consciousness. Marcus wondered how long Emma could hold on, how long she could resist the viral influence that had claimed so many others. The child was their guide, their protector, but she was also becoming something that others would fear and want to destroy. The sound of approaching infected echoed through the streets below. The explosions had indeed drawn them, and they were converging on the house in growing numbers. The group on the rooftop was trapped between a collapsing building and a growing army of the dead. We jump, Marcus decided. It's our only chance. One by one they leaped across the gap between buildings, with Emma helping to catch those who couldn't make the distance on their own. The teenage girl nearly fell, saved only by Emma's quick reflexes and inhuman strength. The elderly man had to be thrown across, his frail body barely making the landing. As the last survivor reached safety, the house finally collapsed, taking with it the evidence of Vex's experiments and the horrors he'd inflicted on so many innocent people. But the doctor's legacy lived on in Emma, a child trapped between human and monster, fighting a battle that she was slowly losing. The rescue mission had succeeded in part, but at what cost? They'd saved several lives, but they'd also unleashed something into the world that might prove even more dangerous than the original infection. Part 7. The Cruel Truth. 3 blocks from the collapsed house, the group of survivors had taken shelter in an abandoned restaurant, its boarded windows providing temporary protection from the infected that roamed the streets. The building still smelled of old grease and rotting food, but it was better than being exposed on the rooftops. Emma sat apart from the others, her transformed appearance making even the rescued survivors uncomfortable despite her heroic actions. Sarah was treating the elderly man's injuries when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Under her small medical flashlight, she could see bite marks on his arm, fresh ones with the telltale signs of viral infection already beginning to show. The wounds were hidden beneath his shirt sleeve, carefully concealed until now. "Walter," she said softly, using the name he'd given them. "When did this happen?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. 3 days ago. I was trying to find medicine for my wife before she turned. One of those things got me, but I managed to get away. I've been hiding it, hoping maybe I was different, maybe I wouldn't change." Marcus overheard and immediately raised his weapon, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Wait, look at him. 3 days with a bite wound and he's still lucid. Still human." Emma moved closer, her transformed senses apparently detecting something the others couldn't. She sniffed the air around Walter, then made a series of clicking sounds that might have been some form of communication. "She's trying to tell us something," Sarah said. "Walter, have you taken any medication recently? Anything unusual?" The old man nodded weakly. "My wife was diabetic. I've been taking her insulin to try to keep my blood sugar stable. Figured it couldn't hurt in this situation." Sarah's medical training kicked into overdrive. "Insulin. That's it. The virus might be affected by blood sugar levels, metabolic changes." "Emma, is that what you're detecting?" Emma nodded, her movements becoming more agitated as she pointed between Walter and herself. Then she did something that shocked everyone. She began to speak, her words distorted but understandable. "Dr. Badman, he knew, insulin stops changing." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Vex knew about a potential treatment, but he didn't use it. He wanted his subjects to transform completely. He could have saved those children, but he chose not to. Marcus felt rage building in his chest. He had a cure, or at least a treatment, and he chose to let people suffer. He could have saved Emma, could have saved all those children. But Emma was shaking her head frantically, her distorted voice struggling to form words. "Not cure, only slows, still changing inside." Sarah examined Walter more closely and her heart sank. Despite his apparent lucidity, there were subtle signs of the infection's progression. Discoloration around his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands, and most telling of all, his body temperature was dropping. "The insulin is buying time," she said grimly. "But it's not stopping the transformation, just slowing it down. Walter, how much do you have left?" The old man pulled out a small insulin pen, nearly empty. "This is it. Maybe enough for one more dose." The rescued family huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide with terror as they realized one of their saviors was infected. The teenage girl, who'd introduced herself as Maya, kept glancing toward the door as if calculating her chances of escape. "We should leave him," Maya said, her voice shaking. "I've seen what happens when people turn. He'll kill us all." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Walter saved your life back at the house. He helped carry you to safety even though he was infected. We don't abandon people." But Marcus was thinking strategically. If Walter turned, they'd be trapped in a confined space with a newly transformed infected. The others would panic, mistakes would be made, and people would die. The pragmatic part of his mind said Maya was right. They should leave Walter behind. Emma solved the dilemma by moving to Walter's side and gently taking his hand with her clawed fingers. The old man didn't flinch, didn't show fear at her transformed appearance. Instead, he looked into her eyes with grandfatherly compassion. "You're still in there, aren't you, sweetheart?" he said softly. "Still fighting to stay human?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her changed face. "Hurts so much to remember." "I know, child. I know." Walter looked at the others. "She's been like this for days, maybe weeks. Fighting the virus, staying human through sheer will. If she can do it, maybe I can too." Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She took the insulin pen from Walter's trembling hands and injected the remaining medication into Emma's arm. The child looked up at her with surprise and gratitude. "Why?" Walter asked, though his voice held no accusation. "Because she's 7 years old," Sarah said, tears in her eyes. "Because she's been fighting this alone for so long. Because she deserves a chance." The insulin had an almost immediate effect on Emma. Her movements became more coordinated, her speech clearer. But they all knew it was temporary, a brief respite in her ongoing transformation. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice almost normal. "I can think clearly now. I can remember who I used to be." Walter smiled, even as the infection began to accelerate in his system. "That's all any of us can ask for, sweetheart. To remember who we were, even when we become something else." Over the next hour, they watched Walter's transformation with a mixture of horror and fascination. Unlike the violent, chaotic changes they'd witnessed in other infected, Walter's progression was almost peaceful. He remained lucid until the very end, talking with Emma about his wife, sharing memories of better times. "Take care of each other," he said as his eyes began to cloud over. "And remember, the virus doesn't have to win. You can choose who you are even when your body betrays you." When Walter finally turned, Emma was the one who ended his suffering. Her clawed hand moved with surgical precision, and Walter's pain was over in an instant. The others watched in stunned silence as the 7-year-old girl who'd retained her humanity performed an act of mercy that none of them had the courage to attempt. "We need to move," Marcus said finally. "The sun's coming up and we're still not safe here." But as they prepared to leave, Emma collapsed, her body convulsing as the temporary effects of the insulin wore off. The transformation was accelerating, and they all knew they were watching a child's final moments of humanity slip away. "I'm scared," Emma whispered, her voice already changing. "I don't want to become like the others." Sarah knelt beside her, holding the child's hand despite the danger. "You won't. You're stronger than the virus. You've proven that." But they all knew the truth. Emma was losing her battle against the infection, and soon she would become something that they might have to destroy. The rescue mission had saved several lives, but it had also forced them to confront the horrible reality that sometimes, being human meant making impossible choices. The cruel truth was that survival often came at the cost of everything that made life worth living. Part 8. The Price of Compassion. Dawn broke over the devastated city like a wound, its pale light revealing the full extent of the destruction that had claimed Portland. From their position in the abandoned restaurant, Marcus could see the smoke still rising from Vex's destroyed laboratory, a black column against the gray sky. The infected had dispersed with the coming of daylight, but their absence provided little comfort to the small group of survivors huddled in the ruins of civilization. Emma lay motionless on a makeshift bed of tablecloths and napkins, her transformation nearly complete. The insulin had bought them precious hours, but the virus was relentless in its progression. Her breathing was shallow, her skin taking on the mottled appearance that marked the final stages of infection. Yet her eyes remained human, filled with awareness and terrible understanding of what was happening to her. Sarah sat beside the dying child, her medical bag open but useless. There was nothing in her training that could help Emma now, no treatment that could reverse what had already been done. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her career saving children, and now she was watching one die in the most horrible way imaginable. "The others are getting restless," Marcus said quietly, gesturing toward the rescued family. They stood near the restaurant's exit, their belongings hastily packed, clearly eager to leave before Emma's transformation was complete. "We can't just abandon her," Sarah replied, though she knew Marcus was right. The practical part of her mind understood that staying with Emma put everyone at risk. When the transformation finished, the child would become a threat to their survival. Maya approached hesitantly, her teenage face showing a maturity that came from witnessing too much horror. "I'm sorry, but we need to go. My little brother is scared and my parents, they've been through enough." Marcus nodded, understanding the girl's position. "Take the family to the fire station. It's defensible and there might be supplies there. Sarah and I will catch up." But Emma stirred, her changed voice cutting through their whispered conversation. "No, don't split up, dangerous." Even in her deteriorating state, Emma was still trying to protect them. The virus had claimed her body, but her spirit remained intact, fighting against the infection's influence with remarkable determination. "She's right," Sarah said. "We stay together. All of us." The family exchanged worried glances, but they didn't argue. Emma's heroism during their escape had earned their respect, even if her current state terrified them. They would stay at least for now. As the morning progressed, Emma's condition continued to deteriorate. Her body was completing its transformation, but her mind remained stubbornly human. She spoke in fragmented sentences, sharing memories of her life before the outbreak, her favorite toy, her pet cat, the bedtime stories her mother used to read. "I remember the park, feeding ducks, with Mommy." Emma's voice was becoming increasingly distorted, but her words were clear enough to understand. She said, "I was her brave girl." Sarah had to turn away to hide her tears. This child had shown more courage in her short life than most adults displayed in their entire existence. Even as the virus consumed her body, Emma continued to fight for her humanity. "You are brave," Sarah said, taking Emma's clawed hand. "The bravest person I've ever known." But time was running out. Emma's lucid moments were becoming shorter, interrupted by periods where the viral influence took control. During these episodes she would growl and snap at the air, her newly transformed instincts seeking prey. Each time she would return to consciousness with horror at what she'd almost done. "Getting worse," Emma whispered after one particularly violent episode. "Can't hold on much longer." Marcus made the decision that none of them wanted to face. He drew his sidearm and checked the chamber, his hand steady despite the emotional weight of what he was about to do. "No," Sarah said firmly. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Marcus replied. "Emma knows it too. Don't you, sweetheart?" Emma nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude rather than fear. "Thank you for trying to save me." But before Marcus could act, Emma's body convulsed one final time. When the spasms stopped, she was gone, not dead but no longer human. The virus had won its battle, claiming another victim despite their best efforts. The thing that had been Emma looked up at them with hungry eyes, its human memories buried beneath layers of viral programming. It snarled and lunged forward, only to be stopped by the restraints Sarah had prepared during the night. "I can't," Marcus said, his weapon lowering. "I can't do it." Maya stepped forward, her young face set with grim determination. "I can't. Emma wouldn't want to be like this." The gunshot echoed through the empty restaurant, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch forever. The child who had saved them all was gone, her suffering finally ended by an act of compassion from someone who barely knew her. Sarah closed Emma's eyes, arranging her transformed body with as much dignity as possible. "She saved us all," she said quietly. "She deserves to be remembered as a hero, not a monster." They buried Emma in the restaurant's small garden, using a wooden cross made from table legs. The inscription, carved with a kitchen knife, read simply, "Emma, age 7, our guardian angel." As they prepared to leave, Marcus realized that their rescue mission had failed in every way that mattered. They'd set out to save a child, but that child had been dead long before they arrived. They'd saved several other lives, but at the cost of witnessing horrors that would haunt them forever. The world had ended and they were still alive. But survival came with a price that grew heavier with each passing day. They were no longer the same people who had heard Emma's voice on the radio 12 hours ago. They'd been changed by their experiences, marked by the weight of impossible choices and devastating losses. The rescue mission was over, but the memories would last forever. They'd come so close to saving Emma, had fought so hard to preserve her humanity, but in the end they'd been too late. The virus had won as it always did, claiming another innocent life in its relentless march across the world. As they walked away from the restaurant, leaving Emma's grave behind, they carried with them the knowledge that sometimes love meant letting go, that sometimes the greatest act of compassion was also the most heartbreaking. They'd failed to save the child they'd come to rescue, but they'd learned something valuable about what it meant to be human in a world that had forgotten humanity. The mission was complete, but the cost had been too high. They were survivors, but they were also the walking wounded, carrying scars that would never fully heal. And in the distance, the city continued to burn, a monument to everything they'd lost and everything they'd failed to save.